back to our study of the book of Genesis. We have discussed the literal beginnings of the world, and we do believe that in 6 24-hour days God created the heavens, the earth, and everything on it, including mankind. And we know that on the seventh day He rested from His work. Obviously, He knew what was going to happen because He created man in His image, which meant man had intelligence and man had the ability to make decisions. And unfortunately, man made the worst decision ever and gave in to the temptation of Satan. Thankfully, the story does not end there. God is merciful, and we can rely on that even to this day. If we do fall into the tempter's traps and snares, we can do just as they did. We can turn to God, and He will cover our sins. So we've gone through now the times of the patriarchs. That's where we're at the beginning of the patriarchs. And what we're going to discuss tonight is called refreshment and rest. And this one was really touching today. If you want to turn with me, I know I asked you to turn to Genesis. Turn to Psalm 107. I'll do things a little different tonight. I thought we'll mix it up. Psalm 107. Being a sailor, this kind of attracted me. Psalm 107. And yes, I'm still a sailor. People look at my head and they say, "You're either Navy or Marines. Why are you in an Army uniform?" And it happens all the time. Happening again today. All right, 107. I'm going to read 23 through 32. 23 through 32. It says, "Some went off to sea in ships, plying the trade routes of the world. They too observed the Lord's power in action, His impressive works in the deepest seas. He spoke and the winds rose, stirring up the waves. Then ships were tossed to the heavens and plunged again into the depths, and sailors cringed in terror. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. 'Lord, help!' they cried in their trouble, and He saved them from their distress." Here we go, verse 29. "He calmed the storm to a whisper and stilled the waves." What a blessing was that stillness as He brought them safely into harbor. Let them praise the Lord for His great love and for the wonderful things He has done for them. Let them exalt Him publicly before the congregation and before the leaders of the nation. Strangely enough, I picked a sailor's passage about navigating the ocean. We're not talking about the Sea of Galilee in this passage. We're talking about the Mediterranean, the mysterious west coast of Israel. You got to imagine back in those days, letting off out into sea was often a one-way trip. Okay, because they didn't have all the special things, all the navigation tools. They couldn't get around storms like we can. As you heard, the storms would rip and wave, and yet many times they would perish in those seas. Spurgeon drew a neat parallel to this psalm between the lives of those on those boats and the lives of some believers. He says, "The Lord sends some of His saints to sea of soul trouble, and there they see, as others do not, the wonders of divine grace, sailing over the deeps of inward depravity, the waste waters of poverty, the billows of persecution, and the rough waves of temptation. They need God above all others, and they found Him." And how do they find Him? All right, Spurgeon goes on, he says, "Though at their wits' end," as it said in the passage, at their wits' end, they had wit enough to pray. Their hearts melted, and it ran out in cries for help. This was well and ended well. They bow in silence at His feet. Where huge billows leaped aloft, there is scarce a ripple to be seen. When God makes peace, it is peace indeed. I love that. When God makes peace, it's peace indeed. He can, in an instant, change the condition of a man's heart so that it shall seem an absolute miracle to him that he's passed so suddenly from the hurricane to the calm. Wow. The stillness. Knowing the stillness of God. Notice that verse. He calmed the storm to a whisper and stilled the waves. What a blessing, that stillness, as He brought them safely into harbor. I want to talk about that stillness tonight. We're going to talk about a period, a short, brief period in Abraham's life, when that stillness was very valuable. As we've discussed, he's come through some very difficult things. He has just kicked Hagar and his son Ishmael out. Right? At the request of Sarah, his wife, he has sent them away, and he had to, because Ishmael was going to just destroy the family. We know that from the prophecy of his life. And so Abraham did what he had to do, and that had to be a tragic thing to do. And so he's already had some very difficult things in his life happen. Now the most important test in life is going to take place. And we're going to see that this period of stillness was there to prepare him for that. So before we get to it, let's go through just some... I'm going to keep the verse later in the study. It says, a time on your handout for personal preparation. Charles Swindoll says, a frenzied pace, frayed nerves, and general shallowness are, sadly, the rule rather than the exception. Life lived in a hurry makes us superficial, fragile, and spiritually depleted. So when the real tests come, we're unprepared for it. I don't know what your life looks like, but my life is pretty crazy. I thought it would get easier when the kids all left, but it didn't. Right? I see you shaking your heads, isn't it? It didn't change. You actually jacked up some of the things that we have to do. And, you know, when you stop and think about it, we do live that way. We Americans do. We live at a crazy pace. We need to learn to take time to be still. And I have to learn to use my clicker. I'm running again. Nobody's going to tell me to stop. All right. Okay, here we go. We need to take time to be still. The way most of our lives are developing today, there's no time to sit back and be still. We seem to fill every waking moment with activity, and when we run out of activity time, we take the non-waking time and we get less sleep. We just fill in the hours so quickly. We wind up being so busy with so many things that we're unable to focus on any one thing or do anything particularly well. I'm speaking of myself. And so here are some reasons why we have to take time to be still. One, we fail to deepen our thoughts. When we are in such a hurry to get everything done, we fail to deepen our thoughts. I call it shallow thinking. I am so busy, don't tell me what you need from me 3 days from now. If you do, I'm not going to remember. You better write it on a post-it note, you better send me an email, and that might even be 3 days before I get to it. Right? Don't tell me what's going to happen 3 days from now, and don't ask me what happened 3 days ago. I have so many plates spinning now, I can only tell you what's happened the last 20 minutes, and what might happen tomorrow. I've been using some examples. I think a lot of you probably feel the same way. It's just called shallow thinking. We've got so many things on our minds that we can't focus on any one thing. And as a result, we don't get into the depth of thought. And when, as he said, when the troubles do come, we're not ready for them. We begin to react rather than act. React rather than act. This is one of the 7 habits of highly effective people that I teach. It's one of the 7 points. Be proactive. Be proactive. Do not react, act. Put a space between the event that took place and your response. Don't react, act. Well, that takes time. That takes investment. Being proactive means you have to think about things. You've got to evaluate things. You have to consider what's going on around you and how you're going to process things. And that way you can actually act when things happen and not react. What happens is we just have so little time to think about things that we wind up reacting all the time. And that does not end well. Right? We need to act, not react. Those are a couple of things that when we don't take time to be still, we have trouble with. Let's consider a couple of examples about the absence of stillness and what people did for them. All right, how about Moses? Does anybody remember what Moses was doing in this general passage, Exodus 18, that was getting him in trouble? He was working too hard. He was working from morning until night. He was the only judge in Israel. He was the only person in all of Israel hearing trials and cases. And he was working himself completely to death. I mean, he had a line in his tent that never ended. And so he never got a break. He could never do the proactive things. He was always helping people deal with their stuff. And what happens? Jethro comes and says, "You're an idiot. Stop it. You're going to wear yourself out. This is not good for you, and it's not good for the nation. Get some people to help you. Delegate." Do you guys like to delegate? I don't like to delegate. I just don't like to do it. Why? Because nobody's going to do it as good as I do it, right? Right? It's true. I'll confess. I am that person. I am that OCD. I don't like other people cutting my grass. That's the biggie. I don't like delegating that. Because I look and there's a mohawk here or there's a corner there that was missed. And boy, that just tears me up. And that's not okay. So it's my own fault if I'm too busy when I won't delegate. And my wife doesn't mind telling me that. Right? That's what Jethro did. Jethro tells him, his son-in-law, he says, look, you got to start delegating. You're running yourself ragged. You are not productive. And he listened. Right? And it was successful. So we need to delegate in order to have time to be still. The next one was David. All right? In 1 Samuel chapter 30, this was a little different story. Here's an example where work became so important that he didn't pay attention. He was so busy that he left camp one day and took all the fighting men with him and did not cover the backside. And the enemy came in and took all the women and all the children and all the stuff. Right? Thankfully, David was able to retrieve it, but that was the hand of God after he confessed and repented. That happens to us, doesn't it? We get so busy, specifically, that we don't pay attention to those who are back home. And this is men and women today. It's happening for both of us. We get so busy with our occupations and our jobs that we do not pay attention to what's going on. I really enjoyed my time in the Navy. I got to talk to a young man about it today. It was really, I just kind of get excited. But like I talked Sunday morning, when we look back to the good old days, they weren't really good if we put it all together correctly. We just remember the fun stuff. But when I was doing this, I remember the not so fun stuff. In 4 years that I was on the Bluefish, I was gone 2.5 years. 2.5 years, no communication, maybe talking every once or twice in a 6-month period. 25 letter familygrams from my wife that come over the airwaves. And it was just too much. I had to choose. If I was going to stay in the Navy, my wife wasn't coming with me, and neither was my daughter. And so I had to come to that place and say, no, we can't do that. I want my family instead. And that's why I'm not retired from the Navy today. We have to look at these things. David was an example. He wasn't watching the home front, and it nearly cost him his wives, that's a different story, and his children. And many people today are so busy they're losing their spouses and their children because of it. All right, simple message. Don't forget what's really important. Martha. Everybody know the story. Right? Martha, Martha, Martha. And Martha and you had Mary. One had it figured out, the other didn't. Martha was busy, man. She was the hostess with the mostest. She knew she had to have every plate and every fork and every spoon, every table setting just right. She had to have all the food done just right. And where was Mary? She was sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Martha was bold enough to just ask, Jesus, would you tell her to get in here and help me? Jesus says, no, she's the one who's got it right. She slowed down. She stopped. I mean, how many other times do you get to sit at the feet of Jesus? That work can be done anytime. She put first things first. She stopped and was still before Jesus. Great example, Martha. Finally, the disciples, Mark chapter 6, verse 31, it's a simple scenario. The disciples are doing so much, the Lord's work. They weren't taking care of themselves, and Jesus made them rest. He made them rest. Might be a silly illustration, but have you ever noticed that people take better care of their cars than they do themselves? There are a lot of people like that. They wax them and they wash them, they change the oil, they put the air in the tires, they keep the fluids up, they check the belts. Why? Because they need the car to run in order to get where they're going. If the car's not running, it doesn't do them any good. The illustration should be looked at for ourselves physically, emotionally, and spiritually as well. We need to check the air in the tires sometimes. We need to check the belts. We need to take care of ourselves. That's really, really important. Even the disciples had to take a break. So now our case in point will be Abraham. Okay? Abraham. So let's go to the text. Where did I put it? All right, I gotta make sure I do the right thing. I lost it. All right. Did I not have it in? I don't think I wrote it down there. All right. See, I've got too many plates in Genesis. All right, Genesis chapter 21, verse 22. Give you a chance to go there if you want to go there. Genesis 21 and 22. This is our focal passage for the evening. Okay, it says, about this time, Abimelech came with Phicol, his commander, to visit Abraham. God is obviously with you, helping you in everything you do, Abimelech said. Swear to me in God's name that you will never deceive me, my children, or any of my descendants. And he had good reason to do that. I have been loyal to you, so now swear that you will be loyal to me and to this country where you are living as a foreigner. Abraham replied, yes, I swear to it. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well that Abimelech's servants had taken by force from Abraham's servants. This is the first time I've heard of it, Abimelech answered. I have no idea who is responsible. You have never complained about this before. Abraham then gave some of his sheep, goats, and cattle to Abimelech, and they made a treaty. But Abraham also took 7 additional female lambs and set them off by themselves. Abimelech asked, why have you set these 7 apart from the others? Abraham reported, please accept these 7 lambs to show your agreement that I dug this well. Then he named the place Beersheba, which means well of the oath, because that was where they had sworn the oath. After making their covenant in Beersheba, Abimelech left with Phicol, the commander of his army, and then he returned home to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he worshipped the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham lived as a foreigner in the Philistine country for a long time. All right? That's neat, interesting. When we look at this, it sounds like a reprieve, and that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Abraham's time of personal preparation. Let's see, the first thing that he does. What's the first thing he does in this story that catches your attention? He did a couple of things. What's the first thing he did? Anybody notice? Oh, he built an altar. That's a good sign that he's always communicating with God. Check this out. As part of his preparation, his time of rest, what did he do? He shored up a relationship. Right? This was really neat, and I had gone by this in studies in the past, and I really missed this, and this time it really struck out at me. This was really neat. Abraham's men had dug a well. They're foreigners. They don't own the land yet. It's been given to them, but they haven't taken possession of the whole thing. And so they're living in somebody else's land, but his people dug the well, and Abimelech's people, the leader of the land, took it from him by force. Now, he had not said anything about this before. And this conversation starts off pretty neat. Abimelech comes to him. He says, look, God's blessing you. I want to make a covenant treaty with you so that we can work together, so that we don't have a lot of hard times. He said, just promise you'll never deceive me. And he had reason, because Abraham was known as a deceiver. So please promise that you won't deceive me. Absolutely. I'll be perfectly honest with you. Your men took my well. See how that happened? He said, all right, I promise you, I'll be honest with you. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is your guys took my well. And notice Abimelech had never heard it before. Right? He's like, well, this is the first time I've ever heard it. And that's not okay. Right? That's passive-aggressive stuff. And that's not all right. He had this open conflict that Abimelech had no idea about. And Abraham was holding it in. Abraham had this conflict with this person. And that is going to disturb your rest. Have you ever had that happen? Have you ever had somebody offended you? Somebody did something wrong to you? And you internalized it, and you thought about it, and it bothered you, and it bothered you, and you never said anything about it? I do it all the time. I mean, I'll confess, I'm as passive-aggressive as it comes. I don't want conflict. Satan gets in my head, just like he does your head, says, you know, if you mention that, there's going to be a big knockdown, drag-out fight. You know, it's not going to go well. If you bring it up, you're just going to make them mad. You're just going to make the situation worse. That's Satan working in your head, because why? He wants us to have conflict between us. He is effective when we are not unified, so that's what he does. When we have this open conflict, he gets in our head and says, nah, you best just leave that alone because it's not going to end well. But I'll tell you, 90% of the time that my experience has been, that other person had no clue that you were offended, just like Abimelech. He had no idea that he had offended Abraham. And he quickly, basically repented of it. So I didn't know that. Here, it's yours. Right? It's all yours. If we would deal with our stuff, it would end that way the majority of the time. Because most of the time, the other person has no idea that you're drinking poison hoping it'll kill them. You know that's what it's like, right? Holding forgiveness from somebody is like drinking poison yourself thinking it's going to punish them. And that's what it's like. In order to find rest and stillness, we've got to be restful and have stillness here. And so we see that in Abraham. The first thing he does is resolve a conflict in a relationship. And now he's got peace with the other leader in the area, Abimelech. All right? Next, he established a place of refreshment. Okay? Abraham knew the importance of having a place to get away, a refreshing oasis it would be. And he went to great lengths to keep it. He gave some of his best livestock. He even kept some extra on the side. And he said, what's those for? Hey, those are just a guarantee that you will admit that my guys built this, that this belongs to me. And so he always wanted to have that place where he can go and rest. Do you have a place where you can go and rest? Do you physically have a place where you can go and be still? I got one. I didn't have it for a long time because we had kids. Now, it's good that the kids are out of the house. The house is empty. And so I've got this Victorian chair. I think it's a funeral parlor chair. We found it in Charleston at one of the hand-me-down stores. Loaded it up in the back of my truck. Brought it to the house. It's nothing, but it's a Victorian. It's kind of cool. And I set it in my dining room. And you've heard me talk about my 70s model Motorola record player, right? I got one of the old boat anchors, but it works. And it's the kind that the arm comes over and you can hold like 4 records at a time. And so for me to relax, I go find these used record stores or antique shops and go flip through all the records and find ones that I like and I take them home. And with no TV, nothing else on, I'll sit them down and I sit in my chair. And it's just still and it's calm and it's quiet. And the days I don't get that, I long for it. I long for it. You got to have a place where you can be alone, a place where there's no interruptions, a place that I set the phone somewhere else. I go plug it in somewhere because it's usually dead. Leave the phone alone, leave the computer off, leave the TV off. I mean, I got some music playing. I mix it up. I found some Johnny Cash and what else did I find this last time? I found some jazz that Lee was looking for. I mean, Ella Fitzgerald. Yeah, Mac the Ninth. And so just whatever it is, old style music playing in the background, and I can just be still and have that depth of thought, have that time to evaluate and think things through. We all need that place. We all need a place to be still, and that's what he did. He established a place for refreshment. Okay? We need to do that. Swindoll says this: all of us need our wells of refreshment, places where we can retreat from life's demands to rest and rebuild. But sometimes those times and places will be invaded and taken over by others. And when they are, we need to retrieve them just as Abraham did. And that's cool. Don't let people steal your time. Make sure you have a time to shut down and be alone. Next thing he did, he planted a tree. All right, this is the last point. He planted a tree, and it wasn't just any tree. Some of you were in our Sunday night study when we studied the 2 kinds of trees, the real important 2 kinds of trees in the Middle East back in those days. One of them was a tamarisk tree, and it was a very special tree in the Middle East. And here's why it's so special. This has significance. I mean, it just wasn't something that he did randomly. A tamarisk tree provided cooler shade. They had a very high salt content, or has, they still exist. The needles have a very high salt content, so they take up the moisture. And so when you are sitting under a tamarisk tree out of the sun, it's a moist coolness. It's a little more cool than a regular shade tree. So he purposely plants this tree that will be very refreshing to sit under. It's an extremely slow-growing tree. All right? It's an extremely slow-growing tree. He did not plant this for himself. He did not plant this for his family, his children. He would have planted this for his grandchildren in the future. He was providing rest and shade for 2 generations away. That's how important it was to him. And these trees, they demand human cultivation. You can't just plant them and leave them and let them grow to die. They take a lot of work. And so we see in the example of why he chose a tamarisk tree, he was making sure that the generation after the generation knew the pleasure of relaxing and resting near the well in the shade, because he knew the importance of those times of rest and preparation. All right? So that's really kind of cool. And I really like that. Obviously, I don't have a well and I don't have a tree, but we need those places. We need those places of refreshment. Okay? Finally, he experienced a time of peace. All right? He experienced a time of peace. God knows when to cause the waves, and he knows when to cause the stillness. And Abraham had some big waves coming. And so this is a period of stillness by God's grace to prepare him for that time. All right, make an application pretty simple. Boom. Being still calls for a place where we can order our private lives. Being still calls for a place where we can order our private lives. A time when we can get quiet and think about what's going on in our own personal lives. Being still gives us time which we can rethink our public worlds. How am I interacting with people? How am I getting along? What do I need to resolve? All right, it takes time to process those things. Being still provides us with an opportunity to see ourselves as we really are. This is the self-reflection. This is the time to look in the mirror and say, how am I doing? All right, how am I doing in my walk? Good time for self-reflection. And being still allows us the privilege of knowing God as he really is. Be still and know, right? To be still and know that I am God. It takes those quiet times to develop the depth of that relationship with God. And again, all these things are important because you never know what's around the next corner, what the next day is going to hold. As we've heard, there's been, and I have ministered to 2 situations today, just like you mentioned earlier, tragic passings of 2 husbands, or 1 child, actually, an adult child, and then a husband that's just here one day and not there the next. We don't know what waves are next. So we have to spend those times of refreshment and peace and stillness so that we're ready and we don't react. We know how to act. And that's the lesson this evening. So Jim, what's our page number?
431.
431. Won't you stand with us and sing page 431?